Hello, my name is Mabel. I'm 68 years old, and I want to tell you a story that changed my life forever. I walked into my daughter's bridal shower, excited to celebrate her happiness, when the fiancé curled his lip and hissed, "The woman who reeks of dogs dared to show her face." I felt my heart sink, and yet I stayed calm, hiding the storm inside me. What he didn't know was that I owned the entire resort where the party was taking place, and that the secrets I had uncovered about him and his family were about to turn their world upside down in ways money could never bury. It was a moment where humiliation and power collided. And I realized that sometimes the greatest battles are fought quietly, with patience, cunning, and love. As I stood there, trying not to let my anger show, I could feel Barnaby, my loyal golden retriever, nudging my leg under the table, reminding me that I was never alone. Every insult, every cruel gesture from that man only fueled my resolve to protect my daughter and reveal the truth. Little did he know, every move he had made to deceive us was being quietly documented, and the reckoning would be inevitable. You won't believe how far the story goes, the secrets that were revealed, and the surprising twist that changed everything for my family. But before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. I love reading your comments and knowing where you are. Now let's understand how the story really began. I walked into my daughter's bridal shower with a mixture of pride, anxiety, and a certain wariness that comes with knowing the world often misunderstands you. The storm outside had left droplets of rain clinging to my coat, and my cardigan was smudged with golden fur from Barnaby's enthusiastic goodbye hug in the car. He had a way of rooting himself in my heart that made leaving him, even for a short while, feel like a betrayal. Yet he wagged his tail at the doorway, his eyes conveying reassurance, as if to say, "I'll be waiting for you, and I know you'll return." It was the only pure, unwavering affection I had known for decades. The kind that doesn't demand explanations, doesn't judge, and never falters. As soon as I stepped into the grand hall, Brad's eyes narrowed, his lip curling in that sneer that always left a taste of malice in the air. "The woman who reeks of dogs dared to show her face," he hissed under his breath, loud enough for the servers nearby to catch a whiff of his disdain. His words were sharp, but they didn't pierce me as they might have 30 years ago. Experience had taught me that true strength often wears the face of patience. What he didn't know, and what none of them knew, was that I owned the entire resort, the space where they laughed and sipped champagne, unaware that the foundation beneath their feet was mine. I could have dismantled their illusions with a single word, a single gesture, but I let the storm rage outside while I measured the storm inside. The room was a riot of soft fabrics, designer dresses, and chattering guests whose faces displayed polite curiosity tinged with judgment. My daughter, Emily, stood across from me, her gaze flicking downward toward her polished shoes, her hands gripping her clutch as though it were a shield. I caught a subtle tremor in her posture, the hesitation that betrayed her love for both of us, caught in the crossfire of her fiancé's cruelty. I wanted to rush forward to gather her into my arms and assure her that the world was larger, stronger, and kinder than the threats whispered into her ear. But I restrained myself, knowing that the lessons we teach in private are more powerful than public confrontation. Brad's mother, a woman polished with privilege and cruelty, seemed to take personal delight in my discomfort. She spritzed herself with perfume, theatrically, as if to erase my presence with a cloud of synthetic roses and civility. Her laughter, high-pitched and sharp, sliced through the warmth of the room, emphasizing the absurdity of her attempt to diminish me. I clutched my purse, feeling the cold brass key to the resort's master suite hidden within its folds. It was more than metal. It was a symbol, a reminder that power doesn't always shout. It waits quietly, patiently, and with precision. I forced myself to smile, that practiced grandmotherly smile that had protected me countless times before. It was the smile of someone underestimated, a silent announcement that the game had only begun. As I drifted toward the buffet, a sea of delicate hors d'oeuvres and sparkling glasses, reflecting the chandelier's light, Brad suddenly grabbed my arm. His grip was firm, meant to intimidate, and his breath carried the faint scent of cheap cologne mixed with fear. "If you embarrass me," he whispered, his voice low and threatening, "you'll never see your grandchildren." There it was, the cruel manipulation designed to twist love into leverage. My heart tightened at the words, a reflexive ache for the family I'd nurtured, for the future I hoped to protect. But I reminded myself quietly that threats are only as strong as the belief you give them. My resolve hardened like the keys resting against my heart. I moved through the crowd, letting eyes meet mine with a fleeting acknowledgement that, yes, there was a storm brewing beneath the surface, one that none of them could anticipate. I caught snippets of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the forced smiles, and beneath it all, a faint undercurrent of unease. The universe has a way of whispering truth into even the most confident heart. I kept my movements slow, deliberate, savoring the moments that would otherwise have passed unnoticed. The slight tremor of a server's hand, the anxious glance of Emily's best friend, the faint scratch of Barnaby's collar against my mind as I imagined him waiting faithfully at home. Each bite of hors d'oeuvre felt symbolic, each sip of champagne a reminder of the life I had built quietly, meticulously, in the years before motherhood had called me back to simpler, humbler pleasures. I thought of the evenings by the fire, Barnaby's head resting on my knee, my fingers tracing the familiar golden fur as if it could absorb all the world's injustices. That warmth contrasted sharply with the coldness radiating from the table where Brad sat, a man so intent on constructing his own illusions that he failed to see the depth of resilience he faced. As the afternoon stretched, I allowed myself a fleeting glance around the room, memorizing faces, noting weaknesses, imagining the precise moment when the scales would tip. This wasn't just about humiliation or revenge. It was about safeguarding my daughter, about retrieving her from a future tainted with greed, deceit, and emptiness. I could see in the subtle droop of her shoulders the seeds of doubt already planted. Emily trusted me without question, though she struggled to acknowledge the truth in the moment. And so I waited, my smile serene, my heart guarded, and my mind calculating with the quiet patience of someone who had learned that storms could be weathered with grace. The hours passed like minutes, and I allowed myself a private conversation with Barnaby in my mind, imagining the gentle brush of his fur, his unwavering loyalty, and the bond that reminded me, constantly, that love is never transactional. It is steadfast, honest, and fearless. Brad might wield words like weapons, but he could not touch the depth of my heart. Nor could he sever the ties of trust and affection between a mother and her child, between a woman and her devoted companion. When I finally left the hall, my steps slow and deliberate, I felt the weight of expectation in the air, the subtle tension of secrets yet unrevealed. I carried with me not anger, not fear, but a resolute clarity. There would be a reckoning, yes, but it would be executed with precision, dignity, and the undeniable authority that comes from years of quiet preparation. And as I walked through the storm toward the car, the rain mingling with my thoughts, I whispered softly to myself and to Barnaby, though he was miles away in spirit, "Hold fast. The world may test us, but truth and love are the weapons that never fail." I drove back to my modest cottage under a gray sky that seemed to mirror the heaviness settling in my chest. The rain pattered softly against the windshield, a soothing rhythm that contrasted sharply with the storm of anger and worry swirling inside me. When I opened the door, Barnaby greeted me like no one else could, his paws scraping the floor in a frantic, joyful rhythm, tail sweeping back and forth with enough force to knock over the small stack of firewood by the doorway. His happy whine was a balm to my frazzled nerves, and I stooped to hug him, feeling the warmth of his coat against my cheeks. He was the only male in my life who offered pure, unconditional love, who asked for nothing in return, who would never whisper threats behind my back or belittle the life I had built. As I closed the door behind me, I took off my soaked coat, letting the fabric drip onto the mat. The golden fur from Barnaby's embrace sticking to my cardigan like a living memory of affection. People in this town assumed, when they saw me trudging through puddles with Barnaby in my rain boots, that I was just another retiree eking out a quiet life on a modest pension. They didn't know the truth that 10 years ago, I had sold my tech company for millions, a decision that had afforded me the freedom to retreat into simplicity, to choose purpose over pomp, kindness over status. Here, in my small cottage with its creaking floors and cozy fireplace, I could be myself without the weight of expectations pressing down. I hung my coat on the peg by the door and sank into the familiar comfort of my kitchen chair, Barnaby padding around me, nudging my hand for a scratch behind his ears. I ran my fingers along his fur, feeling the soft, thick waves, and thought about Emily. My heart ached as images of her at the bridal shower replayed in my mind, her downcast eyes, the hesitancy in her posture, the unspoken pain in the way she avoided confronting Brad. She was a woman in love, yes, but also trapped by fear, caught between loyalty to me and a desire to see the man she thought she could trust. Seeing her diminished, seeing her spirit subtly eroded by someone who had no right to even brush against her life, broke something deep inside me. I sank lower into my chair and began remembering the loans Emily had asked for in recent weeks, small, seemingly innocuous amounts that, at the time, had felt strange to me. Why would a woman with a steady job and independent income ask for cash repeatedly in such awkward, hushed tones? I had chalked it up to the stress of wedding planning, but now the pieces began to fit together with a cold, unforgiving clarity. There had been something off, a quiet alarm that had whispered to me, ignored in the bustle of family life, now screaming in hindsight. Barnaby nudged my hand again, and I reached for the brush. As I ran it through his coat, untangling knots and smoothing out the golden waves, my fingers caught a crumpled piece of paper lodged in the folds of his fur. I unfolded it carefully, feeling the sting of realization before even reading it. It wasn't a receipt for wedding flowers, not a note of trivial expense. It was a gambling debt in Brad's name. The numbers, the merchant, the day tall, pointed to a life of recklessness and deceit I hadn't suspected in full until now. My stomach knotted with a cold, icy fear, the kind that steals breath and replaces it with a steady pulse of dread. This wasn't merely about a rude fiancé, about someone too arrogant or unkind. This was about a man capable of financial manipulation, lies, and the possibility of breaking not just hearts, but lives. I sat back, staring at Barnaby as he blinked up at me with trusting eyes, and I realized the enormity of what I had to do. Protecting Emily was no longer a matter of gentle persuasion or casual advice. It was about uncovering truths she might never see on her own, gathering evidence, and preparing for a confrontation that would need both patience and precision. The weight of responsibility pressed down, and yet, strangely, it felt right. This was my daughter, and my life had given me the tools, the knowledge, and the calm resolve to face this head-on. I reached for the phone, the rotary-dialed number feeling like a lifeline in my hands. The private attorney I had trusted for decades answered promptly, his familiar voice both comforting and professional. A reminder that there were allies in the world who understood discretion and the stakes of legacy. "I need you to start digging," I said softly, carefully controlling the tremor in my voice. "I want everything you can find on Brad. I have reason to believe he isn't who he says he is." There was a pause on the other end, a quiet acknowledgement of the seriousness behind my words. "Consider it done," he said, and I felt a measure of relief, knowing the work would begin even as my mind raced with the possibilities. As I hung up, Barnaby leaned into me, his warmth seeping through the tension, grounding me in the simplicity of the present moment. I scratched behind his ears, whispering quietly, "We'll get through this, boy. I promise we'll keep her safe." My fingers trembled slightly as I traced the contours of his face, feeling the steady beat of his heart under my hand, and I allowed myself a brief, unguarded sigh. There was fear, yes, but also determination. There was anger, yes, but also hope. I moved to the window, watching raindrops streak the glass, each one catching the gray light in a miniature prism, and I thought of Emily, of her innocence, of the way she looked to love for safety. She had been deceived, yes, but she wasn't lost, not as long as I could stand for her, protect her, and guide her through the web of lies. The warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth behind me, and the steady presence of Barnaby at my feet, reminded me that I was never truly alone. That strength often comes in quiet forms, in loyalty, in love, in steady resolve. I traced the edge of the receipt with my finger again, feeling the weight of decisions to come. This was more than a protective instinct, it was a calling, a chance to retrieve not just Emily's dignity, but her future. And as I sank into the familiar comfort of my home, the scent of wet earth from the rain mingling with the faint tongue of wood smoke, I felt a spark of clarity. Storms, whether of rain or deception, could be weathered. I would uncover the truth, shield my daughter, and when the time came, confront the deceit with precision, patience, and the quiet authority earned from a lifetime of knowing that the world often underestimates those who choose to wait. Barnaby shifted closer, resting his head against my knee, and I whispered to him softly, "We've got this, boy. We've got this." The cold knot in my stomach remained, yes, but it was now accompanied by a pulse of resolve, a reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act in spite of it. And in that moment, watching the storm rage outside while we sat together in the cozy warmth of our modest cottage, I realized that the quiet life I had chosen was not a retreat, it was preparation. Preparation to fight, to protect, to retrieve what mattered most, with love as my guiding force. Emily insisted on a peacemaking dinner, her voice too bright over the phone, the kind of brightness that comes from fear disguised as hope. She said it would be good for all of us, that if we could just sit together, eat together, maybe the sharp edges would soften. A thunderstorm rolled in as I drove to her apartment, lightning tearing open the sky in brief, violent flashes. I brought Barnaby with me without apology. I refused to leave him alone during a storm like that, and more truthfully, I refused to face Brad without my quiet anchor beside me. Barnaby pressed against my leg as we stepped inside, his body tense but obedient, his eyes alert. Emily greeted us with a forced smile, her arms wrapping around me just a second too quickly, as if she feared Brad's reaction even to that small affection. The apartment smelled of overcooked pasta and cheap candles meant to mask anxiety. Brad barely looked up from his phone when we arrived. He gave Barnaby a tight smile that never reached his eyes and said nothing to me at all. Dinner unfolded like a performance none of us had rehearsed properly. Brad dominated the table, leaning back in his chair, glass of wine always full, voice loud and self-satisfied. He spoke endlessly about a massive investment he was about to close, numbers spilling from his mouth like bait. Every sentence was polished to impress, every boast sharpened to establish control. I listened quietly, nodding when expected, while under the table, I felt Barnaby flinch. Once, twice, then again. Brad was kicking him. Not hard enough to draw attention, not hard enough for Emily to notice, but deliberately, methodically. The way men test boundaries when they think no one is watching. Each kick landed like a warning. My jaw tightened, my fingers curling slowly around my fork. Barnaby didn't growl. He didn't move. He simply leaned closer to my leg, trusting me completely. That trust nearly broke me. Emily reached for the serving bowl, and as she did, her bracelet slid just enough for me to see the edge of yellowed skin beneath. A bruise, fading but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. The room seemed to tilt, the sound of rain against the windows growing louder, heavier. She noticed my gaze and quickly adjusted the bracelet, her smile faltering for half a second before snapping back into place. Something inside me shifted then. A line was crossed. I had spent my life choosing patience, choosing restraint, choosing quiet strength over spectacle. But kindness has limits. Love has boundaries. And hurting my child was the one thing I would never forgive. So I played my part. I softened my voice, let my shoulders slump just a little, allowed my questions to sound naive. I asked Brad to explain his investment again, slowly this time. I asked where the funds were coming from, who the partners were, what safeguards were in place. Each question was wrapped in politeness, delivered with a faint smile. But I watched closely as sweat gathered at his hairline. He laughed too loudly, waved his hand dismissively, used jargon to hide the fact that nothing he said truly connected. Emily watched him with admiration mixed with something darker in certainty, maybe even fear. I could see her trying to believe, trying to mold herself into the version of reality he demanded. Every time Brad spoke, her posture adjusted slightly, shrinking, accommodating, disappearing. It took everything in me not to reach across the table and pull her back into herself. Then Brad stood abruptly, announcing he needed the bathroom. The chair scraped harshly against the floor as he left the table, irritation trailing behind him like smoke. The room exhaled in his absence. Emily busied herself with the dishes, her hands shaking just enough for me to notice. Brad's phone lit up on the table. I didn't mean to look. I truly didn't. But the screen was bright, the message large, impossible to ignore. My heart stopped before my mind fully processed the words. She's just an old lady. Get her to sign the house over before the wedding or we're dead. The world narrowed to that sentence. Every sound dulled, every breath shallow. Dead. Not embarrassed. Not delayed. Dead. I stared at the screen, the glow reflecting off my trembling hands, and in that moment, the shape of the danger became painfully clear. This wasn't arrogance. This wasn't greed alone. This was desperation sharpened into threat. I looked at Emily, at the woman she was becoming smaller by the day, and something fierce rose up inside me. Not rage. Rage is messy. This was resolve. Cold, steady, unshakable. Brad returned moments later, oblivious, slipping back into his chair with a smug expression, his foot immediately searching for Barnaby again. I met his eyes for the first time that evening and held his gaze just long enough to let him feel something unfamiliar in certainty. I smiled then, soft and grandmotherly, the kind of smile men like him never fear until it's far too late. Inside, I gathered myself. I felt Barnaby's warmth against my leg. I felt the weight of everything I had built, everything I had survived, everything I would protect. The storm outside raged on, thunder shaking the windows, but inside me there was a strange calm. I had seen the truth now, and once truth reveals itself, there is no going back, only forward. Toward justice, toward reckoning, toward reclaiming what love demands we defend. The phone call came early the next morning, the kind that made the sunlight in my kitchen seem suddenly harsh, unforgiving. My lawyer's voice was calm, but there was an edge I could hear if I listened closely, a mixture of disbelief and professional caution. "Mabel," he said, "I've completed the background check. It's worse than you feared. Brad isn't a businessman. He's a con artist, false identities. He's drained 3 other women's inheritances before disappearing entirely, and each case leaves a trail of devastation behind." The words struck like lightning through my chest, leaving a hollow ache that no heartbeat could fill. I sat on the porch in silence, the morning mist curling around the railing like a soft blanket, Barnaby at my feet. His head rested heavily on my knee, eyes steady, trusting, unwavering. I absently scratched behind his ears, feeling the heat of his fur under my fingers, and in that warmth, I tried to anchor myself. This was not just about a rude, arrogant man anymore. This was about a predator masquerading as a partner, weaving deceit into my daughter's life with the meticulous precision of someone who knew no remorse. I watched the sun rise slowly, scattering pale gold over the garden, and thought about Emily. My daughter wasn't just marrying a jerk. She was stepping into a carefully constructed trap, a financial and emotional snare designed to leave her exposed and vulnerable. My chest burned with injustice, a deep, angry fire. I have spent decades building shelters for the homeless, helping those who had nothing to survive and rebuild. And here was a man planning to make my daughter one of them, to strip away her stability, her confidence, and her sense of security. Yet I knew that revelation alone wouldn't save her. Emily was too enamored, too manipulated, too convinced that Brad's charm masked the truth. If I told her what I had learned now, without proof she could see and touch, she would dismiss me, call me paranoid, or worse, resent me. I needed patience. I needed strategy. And most importantly, I needed to catch him in the act, red-handed, with nothing left to deny or rationalize. I took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp air tinged with the scent of rain and earth. Barnaby shifted, sensing my tension, nudging me lightly as if to say, "I'm with you. Whatever comes, we face it together." I smiled faintly, a tight, determined curl of my lips, and promised myself that I would use every tool I had, every ounce of knowledge, and every quiet skill I had honed over decades to protect Emily from the man who threatened to steal her future. By mid-morning, I was behind the wheel of my car, driving the familiar route to the resort, the very resort that bore my name, my signature, my investment, my history. It was strange sometimes to walk through the polished lobby of a place that others assumed I had inherited or rented without question. They did not know that this property, every brick, every railing, every sparkling window, belonged to me. And that knowledge now was my weapon, my leverage, my silent promise that I would not be outmaneuvered. I met with the manager in a discreet office at the back of the building, away from the prying eyes of staff and guests. He had known me for years, a quiet man of integrity, someone who understood that discretion was sometimes more important than duty. I explained the situation in careful terms, my voice low, firm, and deliberate. "Set up hidden cameras in the suite Brad insisted I pay for," I instructed. "No one should know. Every corner, every entrance, every drawer. We need proof. Undeniable, irrefutable proof." He nodded silently, taking notes, his face grave. I felt a rush of relief at his professionalism, at the shared understanding that some battles are won not by loud confrontation, but by quiet, precise observation. I left the office with a sense of purpose, each step measured, each thought sharpened. This was no longer about a simple engagement, no longer about social embarrassment or polite deception. This was about safeguarding the woman I had raised, about ensuring that love did not blind her to danger. As I stepped into the lobby, the polished floors gleaming under the morning light, my heart skipped a beat. There he was, Bridal leaning casually against the check-in counter, smirk curling his lips like he owned the world. His eyes caught mine, and in that fleeting moment, I allowed myself to imagine his surprise, the tiny fracture of certainty that comes when one realizes they have underestimated their opponent. Without missing a beat, he handed me a broom, the gesture dripping with condescension. "Here," he said, smirking, "you missed a spot." He truly thought I was a member of the cleaning staff, a harmless old woman with a dog at her heels and nothing of importance in her hands. He had no idea whose fingers clutched the brass keys to every suite, every corner of the resort. He had no clue that the plans he had so arrogantly laid would be observed, recorded, and dismantled with precision. I took the broom in my hands, letting its handle press against my palm, and for a moment allowed him the satisfaction of his mistake. I smiled faintly, polite, grandmotherly, and walked past him with measured grace, letting him believe he had won. Inside me, however, a storm was rising, quiet, controlled, and lethal in its patience. Every step I took toward the elevator, every thought I allowed to form in the corridors of my mind, was a part of a strategy decades in the making. Brad's arrogance, his entitlement, his belief that an old woman could not pose a threat would be his undoing. And as Barnaby pressed close to my leg, sensing my resolve, I felt a surge of quiet power. For the first time since learning the truth, I allowed myself a tiny, secret smile. This wasn't just about money. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about justice. It was about protecting my daughter from a wolf dressed in groom's clothing, a man who thought charm could disguise cruelty. And I knew, with a certainty that steadied my heartbeat, that the moment to reveal the truth would come. And when it did, it would be undeniable, irreversible, and transformative. I accepted the broom with a hand that trembled only slightly, though inside I was boiling with every ounce of contained fury I could muster. Brad's smirk was the kind that oozes self-satisfaction, the arrogance of someone who believes the world is composed entirely of pawns and spectators. "Clean up this mess, Mabel," he said, his voice dripping with scorn. "It's about the only thing you're good for." The words landed on me like stones, meant to bruise, meant to wound, and for a heartbeat, I let them sting. Around us, the staff froze, silent witnesses to a scene none of them could intervene in. They glanced at one another, faces pale, eyes wide with a mixture of horror and disbelief. None dared speak, none dared reveal my identity. They had seen me in this building countless times, passing through as quietly as a shadow, but Brad's assumption that I was merely a frail, inconsequential woman had momentarily fooled even them. And in that pause, I realized just how dangerously underestimated I truly was. I inhaled slowly, forcing my body to obey a rhythm my mind had learned decades ago. My jaw clenched, my shoulders relaxed just enough, and I began sweeping. Each stroke of the broom against the polished floor was deliberate, measured, a silent reclamation of power. I could feel the eyes on me, some curious, some fearful, and it struck me with a bittersweet clarity. Humiliation is temporary, but dignity is eternal. I reminded myself silently that the fall is always harder when you are standing on a pedestal. And that pedestal was mine, even if Brad had not yet realized it. Brad chuckled, loud and cruel, his tone meant to draw attention, to make everyone complicit in my supposed inferiority. "Don't miss a spot," he taunted, leaning casually against the counter. He believed himself untouchable, shielded by arrogance, charm, and the ignorance of those around him. I did not look at him, not directly. I let him imagine he had succeeded. I let him revel in his small victory while I quietly prepared the real one. When the broom finally rested against the wall, I excused myself, citing the need to get some fresh air. Outside, the storm had given way to a tentative calm, and I decided to take Barnaby to the park nearby. He bounded ahead, nose twitching, tail wagging with the kind of unfiltered joy that reminds you of life's simple pleasures, the small truths that remain even when everything else feels rotten. We reached the bench Brad often used for his phone calls, a quiet, unassuming spot shielded by trees, sunlight filtering softly through the leaves. Barnaby's instincts, sharp and unerring, led him straight to a mound of earth that seemed unremarkable to anyone else. He began digging with deliberate purpose, paws scrabbling, nose pushing, until an old leather wallet emerged from its hiding place. My breath caught as I reached for it, the weight of anticipation mixing with dread. Inside was an ID, crisp and clear, but with a name that did not match the man I knew. Brad's photograph stared back at me, the same confident, smirking face, but the name belonged to someone else entirely. My stomach churned as understanding dawned. This was not just fraud, not just a web of lies spun for monetary gain. This was someone who had built a lifetime of deception, hiding from a past that was far darker and more dangerous than mere theft. The implications hit me like cold water. My daughter's life was entangled with someone who had spent years constructing a shadow, a phantom identity, and I had to act carefully, decisively, and strategically. I sat on the bench, Barnaby's head resting in my lap, and I allowed myself a moment to feel the weight of the world. There was anger, yes, but there was also clarity. Fear had its place, but fear without action is meaningless. I felt the pulse of resolve building inside me, steady and unshakable, and I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I reached for my phone and dialed Emily, careful to keep my tone casual, warm, and inviting. "Emily," I said softly, "I thought I'd give you both an early wedding gift." There was a pause on the line, the faint sound of her curiosity pressing through. "It's a business meeting," I continued, "with a wealthy investor who can help Brad. Someone who knows how to guide a big investment." I let the words hang in the air, carefully measured. A breadcrumb designed to lead him toward the truth without alerting him to our awareness. I imagined her reaction as she processed the idea, the smile she would try to force, the excitement she would feel for Brad. And in that imagination, I felt a bittersweet pang joy for her hope, grief for the innocence it still held, fragile and precarious. My voice softened further. "It will be at a private location, something quiet and professional. I just thought it would help him, and you get ready for the big day." As I hung up, Barnaby leaned against me, his warmth a tether to reality and purpose. I thought about the path ahead, the careful orchestration that would be required, the patience that would be tested, and the inevitable confrontation with truth. This wasn't merely a battle of money or reputation. It was a test of endurance, love, and moral clarity. My daughter's safety, her future, depended on the precision of each move, the timing of each revelation, the quiet power of undeniable proof. The park was empty, save for the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant hum of city life. I felt the enormity of what lay before me, and yet in the rhythm of Barnaby's breathing, in the weight of the wallet in my hand, in the certainty of purpose that surged through me, I felt hope. Justice could be precise. Protection could be quiet. Love could be resolute. And as Barnaby nudged my hand, tail wagging in a slow, steady rhythm, I whispered to him, "We're getting ready, boy. We're preparing for the moment they can't deny the truth." In that moment, I understood fully that the greatest strength is often invisible, residing not in anger or brute force, but in patience, observation, and unwavering commitment to what is right. And as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long, soft shadows across the park, I felt a sense of calm determination. The pieces were falling into place, the stage was set, and when the time came, every deceit, every lie, every false identity would unravel before our eyes. Brad's eyes lit up the moment I mentioned my old friend, the one who had expressed interest in investing $5 million into a promising venture. It was a glint of greed so pure and immediate that it made my skin crawl, yet at the same time, it reinforced everything I already knew about him. He had no depth, no loyalty, no respect for anyone except himself. And he certainly had no idea that the investor he imagined, a wealthy old friend of mine, impressed by charm and reputation, was, in fact, a forensic accountant I had meticulously hired to examine every paper, every number, every claim he might produce. We met at a restaurant that exuded wealth and quiet sophistication. One of those places where the waiters glide silently and the lighting flatters the guests as much as the polished wood tables. I had chosen the venue carefully, a setting that suggested elegance and status, yet also one that allowed discreet observation. I wore my best pearls, strung carefully around my neck, gleaming softly against the folds of my silk blouse. Brad looked at me with mock surprise, letting a cruel smile curl on his lips. "Well, well, Mabel," he said, laughter in his voice, but venom beneath it. "Finally pawning your little junk, are we?" I smiled gently, the kind of smile that hides a steel core, letting him believe he was in control. I allowed him the illusion of superiority while I mentally catalogued every flaw in his behavior, every slight hesitation, every tell that might betray the truth beneath his polished surface. Emily, I knew, would be watching her eyes full of hope for the man she believed she loved. And my heart ached, seeing her trust poised so delicately on the edge of betrayal. Brad began presenting his documents, each one carefully crafted, every figure a calculated deception. He was confident, poised, the kind of man who believed that charm could cover any lie. He spoke with ease, leaning back in his chair, arms spread casually, as if the world itself had no power over him. But, under the table, Barnaby had already assessed the situation, his ears flicked, nose twitching, eyes narrowing. He knew instinctively that danger lingered, that Brad's presence was a threat not just to me, but to Emily, and perhaps to the fragile veil of morality that remained in this room. Brad's hand trembled slightly as he placed the documents on the table, though he masked it with a flourish of overconfidence. He did not notice when his napkin fell to the floor, or when he bent slightly to retrieve it. Barnaby, lying patiently at my feet, immediately stiffened. His low, protective growl rumbled in the quiet air, a warning neither to be ignored nor dismissed. Brad froze mid-movement, recoiling as though the dog had somehow exploded in the space between us. A flash of real fear crossed his face before he quickly smothered it with a forced grin. I watched carefully as he signed the preliminary contract, which he believed secured his fortune, his power, his future. In reality, it was an airtight confession of assets and evidence of felony fraud, captured in a form so subtle that he would never suspect it until the authorities arrived. Each stroke of his pen felt like the measured cadence of a metronome, marking the rhythm of his own downfall. I allowed a moment for the satisfaction to bloom quietly in my chest, tempered by the solemn awareness that this was not a game. This was the protection of my daughter's life and inheritance. Brad leaned in across the table as our glasses clinked in a toast, his breath faintly smelling of arrogance and cheap cologne. His voice dropped to a whisper, chilling in its familiarity and intent. "Once the check clears," he said, letting each word fall with deliberate malice, "you're going into a state home, Mabel." I felt a shiver run through me of fear, but of clarity. Here he revealed his true nature, his worldview, and the depths of his contempt for anyone who might challenge him. And yet, I was steady. My hand rested on the table near Barnaby, who lifted his head slightly, gaze unwavering. I let the moment linger, tasting the tension, letting it settle deep in my bones as a reminder of what was at stake. I returned his whisper, with nothing outwardly, but inside I was acutely aware of the long path that had led us here. I had endured humiliation. I had walked through storms both literal and figurative, and I had learned to read people like open books. Brad's greed and arrogance were tools now, weapons turned against him, and I would wield them with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime observing the fragility of human pride. As the evening progressed, I engaged him with careful questions, feigning curiosity, letting him elaborate, letting him drown in his own words, all the while watching the subtle reactions of the forensic accountant, who smiled faintly beneath the table, nodding imperceptibly at the validity of our trap. Brad's confidence was a facade, fragile and illusory, and every lie he spoke only cemented the evidence of his guilt. Barnaby's presence was a quiet reassurance, a tether to reality, a reminder that instincts sometimes see further than reason. When Brad nervously gestured under the table again, the dog's growl reminded him that he was not untouchable, that control is never absolute when one underestimates the silent observer. By the time dessert arrived, Brad was convinced he had secured his fortune, his victory, his dominance over the situation. I allowed him that illusion, knowing full well that the very documents he believed to be the keys to his empire were instead the chains that would bind him when the moment came. I sipped my wine slowly, pearls catching the soft light. Eyes steady, a calm within the storm, a quiet professional wielding patience as a weapon. The meal ended with polite smiles, restrained handshakes, and the faint hum of the restaurant around us. Brad left with his ego inflated, unaware of the web closing around him. Barnaby, content now that danger had been assessed and managed, rested his head against my ankle. His presence a reminder that loyalty, instinct, and quiet courage often triumph over greed, arrogance, and malice. And as we walked out into the night, the cool air brushing against my face, I felt the weight of the next steps settle around me like a cloak of resolve. The trap was set, the bait taken, and soon the reckoning would come clean, inevitable, and just. The day before the wedding, the air in my cottage felt heavy, charged with a tension I couldn't shake. I had barely slept the night before, the shadows of what was to come stretching long across the walls. The phone had rung early, insistent, and I knew before I picked it up that it would be them Brad's parents, the vultures who believed greed and entitlement could secure them anything. When they arrived, I welcomed them with all the politeness and serenity I could muster, hiding the storm that churned inside me. Their eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the cottage as if they were already appraising it, measuring its worth against the cost of their daughter's wedding. They didn't see the years of labor, the quiet nights spent building a life that could sustain more than just me. They only saw a prize, something to take, to manipulate, to use. And their demand was cruelly precise. I was to sign over the deed to my cottage as collateral for the wedding expenses they insisted they had covered. I took the pen with a trembling hand, feigning frailty as though I were a delicate old woman on the brink of collapse. I let them see it, the slight shake of my fingers, the slow, careful inhalation, the faint, fragile tilt of my shoulders. Their eyes widened, a flash of triumph crossing their faces. And I allowed them this illusion of victory, this moment of hollow satisfaction. They believed they had won, that my weakness was exposed, that their demands would be met without question. "I'll sign," I said softly, my voice a gentle tremor that hid the steel beneath. "But we must do it at the wedding venue, in front of everyone, as a ceremony of family unity." The words spilled out with delicate precision, each one carefully chosen to manipulate the situation without them realizing it. Their eyes flickered with confusion, a brief hesitation, but greed always blinds clearer than sight. They agreed immediately, imagining the public humiliation I would endure, the exposure of my financial vulnerability, the stripping away of the last piece of property I owned outright. They did not see the truth that lingered just beneath the surface, that this act, performed in their arrogance, would be the stage on which their own folly would be revealed. That night, the house was silent, except for Barnaby's gentle breathing beside me. I sat on the sofa, cradling his head in my lap, fingers tracing the soft curves of his ears, and let the tears fall. I did not cry for the house, for the cottage was merely a building. No, I cried for Emily, for the daughter I loved more than life itself, for the pain she was about to endure when the illusion of her life crumbled under the weight of deceit. I whispered to Barnaby, as if he could understand every nuance of my grief, "We have to protect her, boy. We have to make sure she never gets hurt by this man." And he nudged my hand, offering comfort without judgment, a quiet promise that we would face the darkness together. Sleep came fitfully, each hour haunted by the images of Emily's smile, her hope, her trust in Brad. I imagined the morning sun cutting through the resort's windows. It's the anticipation of the wedding, the carefully constructed happiness that she believed was real. And I knew that by noon tomorrow, every illusion would be on trial, every lie exposed, every pretense dismantled. But first, I had to prepare myself. The next morning, I arrived at the resort not in my old cardigan, not in the casual clothes that Brad and his family assumed were all I owned, but in a tailored suit I hadn't worn since my CEO days. The jacket fit like armor, the fabric a reminder of a time when my decisions commanded respect, when my presence alone could shift a room. My shoes clicked softly on the marble floor, each step deliberate, each motion measured. I looked at myself in the mirrored lobby and saw not a frail old woman, but a matriarch who had spent a lifetime building, protecting and defending what was hers and what belonged to those she loved. Barnaby walked beside me, his gait steady, his head held high, and I felt the warmth of loyalty and instinct grounding me. He was more than a dog. He was a sentinel, a silent witness to every plan, every moment, every heartbeat of this quiet war we were waging. The staff greeted me with respectful nods, some wide-eyed at the transformation, none daring to comment, for they had learned long ago that Mabel was never as she appeared. As I walked toward the office where the documents would be signed, I allowed myself a deep, cleansing breath. The pen that would be placed before me, the signature they assumed I would provide, would be part of a play carefully choreographed over weeks. One designed to bring justice without unnecessary confrontation, to expose greed and cruelty without stooping to their level. I felt a mixture of anticipation and melancholy, the tension of the impending revelation tempered by the knowledge that Emily's life would soon be free of deception. I imagined her face when she arrived, the mix of excitement and anxiety, the nervous laughter, the hopeful glances toward Brad. And in that moment, I promised myself that the facade I had maintained, the feigned weakness, the careful patience, would culminate in a revelation that was not just about money, not just about property, but about integrity, love, and the triumph of truth. Barnaby nudged my hand again as if sensing my resolve, and I whispered to him, "It's almost time, boy. Almost time to show them who we truly are." And in that quiet, unassuming moment, I felt a profound sense of purpose, a calm determination that no amount of greed, arrogance, or malice could shake. The trap was set, the stage was ready, and tomorrow, every lie would unravel, every false confidence would crumble, and Emily would step into her future with clarity, strength, and the unshakable knowledge that she was protected by a love that could not be bought, manipulated, or diminished. The rehearsal dinner began under the soft glow of chandeliers, the kind that made crystal glasses sparkle like tiny suns suspended in the air. Guests murmured politely, laughter spilling lightly across the room, but I could feel the tension coiled tightly around me. A taut wire strung between the anticipation of what was to come and the fear that the moment might falter. Brad was already standing, glass in hand, the room giving way to his presence with the familiarity of arrogance. He cleared his throat and smiled, that practiced, smug expression I had come to despise, and began his toast. "Let's all raise our glasses to the bride," he said, his voice smooth but edged with venom, "and to her mother, Mabel, for finally contributing her little cottage to the festivities. How generous of you." Laughter rippled through the room, polite at first, then a little sharper as his words sank in. I saw some guests glance at me with curiosity, but mostly with sympathy, the kind of quiet, fleeting sympathy one offers to someone perceived as weak. I felt Barnaby at my side, his warm body brushing against my leg, the steady rhythm of his heart beneath the golden fur grounding me. He looked up at me with eyes that reflected loyalty, intelligence, and an unspoken understanding of the gravity of this evening. I bent slightly, whispering to him, "Patience, boy. All in good time. We've prepared for this." He gave a soft whine, as if affirming that he was ready to play his part, ready to protect, ready to witness. Taking a deep, steadying breath, I left my chair and walked toward the microphone at the front of the room. My heels clicked softly against the polished floor, echoing in the silent gap that had opened as Brad's smug expression faltered at the sight of me moving with purpose. I could feel the curious eyes of our guests, the whispers that stilled into anticipation, and the faint tightening of the muscles in Brad's jaw as he realized that perhaps he had underestimated me. Barnaby trotted proudly beside me, his golden coat gleaming under the warm light, the gentle sway of his tail a quiet announcement that we were entering the stage together, a unit bound by loyalty and instinct. I straightened my back, lifted my chin, and projected my voice. "I'd like to say a few words." The room fell completely silent, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioning and the clinking of cutlery left untouched on tables. My voice was calm, commanding, unshakable, carrying the weight of years of experience, of patience, of resilience. "You don't need my cottage, Brad," I began. My words deliberate, measured, each syllable carrying the weight of truth and inevitability. I lifted my hand toward the staff now standing behind the curtains, giving the silent signal I had rehearsed countless times. With a subtle motion, the curtains dropped, revealing the resort's logo emblazoned on the wall, large and unmistakable, with my signature clearly inscribed beneath it, because I own this hotel. I own the land it sits on, and I own the debt your parents are trying to run from. The effect was instantaneous. Brad's face paled, a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth betraying the shock he was trying desperately to suppress. His eyes darted around the room, seeking a lifeline, a mask to hide behind, but there was none. The waiters who had been serving drinks and hors d'oeuvres now stepped forward in unison, their movements deliberate and unhesitant, revealing themselves as federal agents I had coordinated with over the past weeks. Each uniformed man and woman exuded authority, their presence a physical manifestation of the truth I had quietly orchestrated. Emily's eyes widened, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. She stood, confusion and disbelief etched across her face as she turned from me to Brad, seeking answers that only the moment could provide. Her expression flickered with fear, anger, and sorrow, the emotions of someone realizing that the man she thought she loved was nothing more than a deception woven from lies and greed. My heart ached as I watched her struggle to reconcile the reality with the hope she had carried so faithfully. Brad tried to regain composure, attempting a forced laugh, a gesture meant to disguise the panic rising within him. His words stumbled, faltered, This isn't what it looks." But the agent's disciplined stance silenced him before he could finish. The room was still, every eye focused, every attention fixed on the unraveling of a man who had relied on arrogance and manipulation to shield himself from accountability. I stepped closer to the microphone, my gaze sweeping over the faces of the guests, the family, the friends, and finally resting on Emily. "Emily," I said softly, with a tenderness that pierced through the tension, "this is why I had to wait. This is why I couldn't just tell you. Truth, when wrapped in lies, is powerless. It needs proof, and now you have it. You are safe. You are free." Barnaby nudged my hand with his nose, a gentle reminder of his unwavering presence and the silent support that had carried me through every storm. I reached down, stroking his head, feeling the warmth of his fur under my fingers. A tactile anchor in the maelstrom of revelation. He had been my partner, my confidant, my sentinel through this journey, and now he shared in this victory with me. Brad's parents stood frozen, their faces contorted with disbelief and fear as they realized the enormity of their miscalculation. Their greed, their arrogance, had led them into a trap they could never escape. And the reality of their daughter's safety, their son-in-law's duplicity, and my strategic patience all collided in that single, overwhelming moment. Emily's tears fell freely now, unrestrained, as she stepped toward me, wrapping her arms around my waist. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling, I don't know what to say." I held her close, feeling the tension in her body slowly release, her grief and relief mingling in a cathartic wave that filled the room with the quiet resonance of truth finally prevailing. I adjusted my pearls and smiled, my hand lingering on Emily's shoulder, grounding her and myself. The room had shifted, the dynamics of power and deceit dismantled, leaving only the raw, unvarnished clarity of reality. Brad's mockery, his lies, his cruel illusions all had been stripped away, revealing the truth in its purest, most liberating form. Barnaby rested his head against my ankle, tail wagging slowly, as if approving the resolution. I looked down at him, whispering softly, "We did it, boy. She's safe. We're all safe." And in that moment, a profound peace settled over me, the satisfaction not of revenge, but of justice tempered with love, of protection fulfilled, of a daughter's life reclaimed from deception. The evening continued, hushed and reverent, guests processing the revelation, Emily recovering in my embrace, and the weight of fear lifting from the room like mist at dawn. The trap had snapped shut, and the consequences of truth, patience, and unwavering love had illuminated every shadow, leaving a path forward paved with clarity, safety, and the quiet triumph of justice. The moment hung in the air, heavy and electric, as Brad's panic became almost palpable. I could see it in the subtle twitch of his fingers, the rapid rise and fall of his chest, the way his gaze darted around the room, seeking an escape that no longer existed. Every step he took toward the exit, I could feel the tension in Barnaby's body coiling like a spring. His ears flattened slightly, and a low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a warning, a promise that no one would leave without facing the truth. Brad lunged, desperate, but Barnaby moved with precision and intent, planting himself squarely in the doorway. The golden retriever, whose gentle demeanor had always masked an instinctive courage, barked fiercely, the sound reverberating through the room. It was a sound that carried authority, a sound that made even the bravest hesitate, and Brad faltered. His eyes widened in shock and fear as he realized that he would not escape, that every step forward was met with the unwavering barrier of loyalty and instinct embodied in this magnificent animal. The lead agent stepped forward, his presence calm but commanding, and began to cuff Brad with deliberate care. "It's not just fraud," he declared, his voice clear and authoritative. "The ID your dog found belongs to a missing person. We found the rest of the evidence in his car." The room gasped collectively, the sound mingling shock, horror, and a dawning comprehension. Brad was no ordinary con artist. He was dangerous. He was a man who had built a facade of charm and deceit, masking darker truths that could have ruined more than just my daughter's finances. Relief surged through me, but it was tempered with a quiet sorrow, a recognition of how close Emily had come to devastation. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear or anger, but from the sheer weight of responsibility lifted from my shoulders. I had spent years preparing, calculating every move, predicting every reaction, and now it had come to fruition. Emily was safe, shielded from the worst of this man's machinations, and I could finally breathe, knowing that my patience and strategy had preserved her future. Brad's mother stepped forward, her face contorted with the feigned innocence she had perfected over decades. "I didn't know," she claimed, her voice quivering in a way that was almost theatrical. but I knew better. I had anticipated her performance, had gathered evidence to ensure that her deception would be exposed just as surely as her son's. From the folds of my purse, I pulled the small recorder I had hidden during the party weeks before. I pressed play, and the room filled with her voice discussing, in cold and calculated terms, splitting Emily's life insurance money with Brad. The words echoed off the walls, leaving no room for deniability. Emily's eyes widened as the realization sank in, the pieces of her life rearranging themselves into a new, horrifying image. She turned to look at me, a silent question in her gaze, and I simply nodded, my hand resting on her shoulder. It's all here, Emily. Every lie, every deception. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. She took a deep, shuddering breath, processing the enormity of the truth, the betrayal, and the relief that followed in equal measure. Then, as though propelled by a mixture of anger, grief, and righteous indignation, Emily stepped forward. Her hand rose, and the slap landed with the force of clarity and justice, reverberating through the silent ballroom. It was a release, a physical manifestation of the emotion she had kept bottled for too long: fear, hope, love, and the desire to protect herself from the man she had thought she knew. The room held its collective breath, the sound of impact marking a turning point, a breaking of illusions that could never be rebuilt. Brad's protests were almost comical in their desperation. "You witch! You!" His voice cracked, the words failing him as the agents guided him firmly but carefully toward the exit. Barnaby padded alongside, maintaining his protective presence, ensuring that the path forward remained controlled, safe, and decisive. I adjusted my pearls with a quiet, steadying motion, meeting his gaze with the calm certainty that had guided me throughout this ordeal. "No, dear," I said softly, almost conversationally, though my tone carried the weight of every decision, every plan, every sleepless night spent ensuring this moment would succeed. "I'm a mother." The words were simple, but they held the power of truth, of love, of protection. They resonated across the room, a quiet declaration that the instincts and resilience cultivated over decades were far stronger than greed, deceit, or malice. I turned to Emily, brushing a stray tear from her cheek, and saw the flicker of gratitude, relief, and unspoken admiration. She leaned into me, resting her head briefly against my shoulder, and I could feel her tension dissolve, the knot of fear and betrayal unraveling. The room slowly exhaled with us, the collective awareness settling in that the danger had passed, that justice had been served, and that the bond between mother and daughter, strengthened by love, patience, and quiet vigilance, was unbreakable. Barnaby nudged my hand, his tail wagging slowly, and I whispered, "We did it, boy. We saved her." The words were both a celebration and a quiet acknowledgement of the journey, the sleepless nights, the careful orchestration, and the unwavering loyalty of a companion who had shared in every risk and triumph. Brad's mother was escorted away, her protests fading into echoes as Emily and I stood together, side by side, feeling the enormity of what had just transpired. The room was filled with hushed conversations, eyes wide with astonishment, guests whispering about the events they had just witnessed. But for us, there was a singular clarity. The danger had passed, the truth had emerged, and Emily's life was hers to reclaim, free from manipulation, free from deceit, and free to move forward with the assurance of love, protection, and the knowledge that some things, like the bond between a mother and her child, or the loyalty of a devoted companion, were unassailable. I looked at Emily, her face still flushed with residual emotion, and smiled. "Let's go home, my darling. It's over. And this time, the only things you inherit are love, safety, and the chance to begin again." She nodded, a tearful but genuine smile spreading across her face, and I felt a warmth, deep and unshakable, suffuse through me. The final twist had revealed more than the truth about Brad. It had revealed the enduring strength of family, loyalty, and the quiet, formidable power of a mother's love. The day had begun with tension so thick, it felt almost tangible. The remnants of Brad's deception still echoing in the corners of the resort's grand ballroom. But as I watched the clock tick past the original wedding hour, I realized that the power to transform despair into hope was in my hands. The wedding was canceled, yes, but what had begun as a tale of deceit and fear had the potential to end as something far more profound, a celebration of freedom, truth, and resilience. I rose from my seat, feeling the cool weight of Barnaby's head against my leg, and whispered, "Let's show them what real strength looks like." His tail thumped in agreement, a steady heartbeat of companionship and loyalty. I moved among the guests, who had been frozen in shock just hours before, their expressions shifting from surprise to curiosity as I spoke softly, offering reassurance and purpose. "The wedding may not go on," I said, "but tonight, we celebrate honesty, courage, and the power of reclaiming what is ours to protect." Emily's eyes widened, glistening with unshed tears, as she looked at me, searching for guidance in the storm of emotions still churning inside her. I held out my hand, and she took it without hesitation, leaning into me as I murmured, "Sometimes good hearts are tricked, Emily, but they are never truly broken. They heal, and they grow stronger for it." Barnaby walked beside us as we approached the center of the room, and I felt a surge of pride for this golden retriever who had been more than a companion. He had been a sentinel, a partner, and a symbol of unwavering loyalty. Guests began to murmur among themselves, inspired by the transformation, the sudden shift from humiliation and fear to purpose and joy. I made an impromptu announcement. "Since the reason for the celebration no longer exists, we will turn this evening into a charity gala. Every donation, every gift, every contribution will go to help women who are trapped, deceived, or silenced. Tonight, we turn tragedy into action." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling as the concept sank in, filling the room with a new energy that replaced the tension that had gripped us all. Emily clung to me then, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "Mom, I'm so sorry for everything," she whispered, her voice trembling, raw and unguarded. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat and the warmth of her body pressed against mine. "Emily," I soothed, "you don't need to apologize. You are strong, and your heart is good. That's what matters. Sometimes good hearts are tested, and sometimes they're deceived, but they heal. Always, they heal." The intensity of the moment was cathartic, a release of months, maybe years of fear, worry, and helplessness. Barnaby rested his head on my foot, his presence grounding us, a reminder that protection and loyalty could manifest in the gentlest yet most profound ways. Later, we moved to the terrace of my resort, the sunset painting the sky in streaks of amber, rose, and violet. The warmth of the evening sun mingled with the cool sea breeze, carrying away the remnants of fear and replacing them with quiet serenity. Barnaby lay at our feet, gnawing happily on the steak bone I had ordered especially for him, tail wagging lazily as he savored the reward of his vigilance. I watched Emily lean back in her chair, exhaustion and relief softening her features, and I felt a deep, unspoken bond settle over us, stronger than anything deception could have threatened. I took a sip of champagne, the bubbles tingling against my tongue, and looked at Emily with a gentle smile. "We'll use this," I said, voice firm with resolve and tenderness, "to help other women trapped in situations like the one you nearly endured. This trauma, this fear, will become our mission, our way of making a difference. We will turn pain into purpose and loss into hope." Her eyes met mine, shimmering with both sorrow and inspiration, and I knew she understood, not just the words, but the depth behind them. Life has a curious sense of irony. They had thought me a weak-old woman with a smelly dog. Someone who could be dismissed, underestimated, and taken advantage of. But golden retrievers, after all, are bred to retrieve. And tonight, I had retrieved something far more precious than property or money. I had retrieved my daughter's life, her sense of safety, her dignity, and the truth she deserved to know. It was a quiet triumph, one that required patience, intelligence, and a heart unshakable in its love. I scratched Barnaby behind the ears, feeling the soft give of his fur beneath my fingers, and he looked up at me with eyes filled with that same unspoken loyalty, as though acknowledging our shared victory. I leaned back in my chair, letting the warmth of the sunset wash over me, the gentle murmur of guests still celebrating, the soft laughter of Emily finally at ease, and the rhythmic sound of Barnaby's breathing fill the air. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt complete peace, the kind that comes from knowing your family is safe, the truth has prevailed, and love has guided every step. As the evening settled into calm, I raised my glass once more, a silent toast to resilience, love, and the promise of new beginnings. "To life," I whispered, and Emily echoed softly. "To life," her voice steady and full of hope. Barnaby thumped his tail against the floor as though agreeing, and in that moment, the world seemed right, whole and full of possibility. And as we watched the last light of the sun dip below the horizon, I realized that sometimes the most ordinary things, a loyal dog, a patient heart, the courage to wait, become the instruments of extraordinary outcomes. Life had tested us, tried to break us, but it had also revealed our capacity to rise, protect, and love fiercely. If you were moved by our story and want to witness more journeys of courage, family, and heart, please subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories where love, resilience, and hope prevail, and I'd love to share them with you.